The document they filed it under was called a Precautionary Incident Summary. That was the institutional language. Calm, bureaucratic, stripped of anything that might suggest the people who wrote it had been frightened. But the Velsheri Conclave had 17 different classifications for threat assessments, and this document had been assigned to none of them. It existed in a category that had been created specifically for this event, and the category had no official name because the committee responsible for naming it had submitted 3 different proposals over 2 galactic cycles and rejected all of them on the grounds that every name they chose felt inadequate. The document simply said, *for internal distribution. Classification pending. Do not forward to human diplomatic channels, *. That last line was added 6 months after the events it described. Nobody wanted to explain to humanity what had happened. More specifically, nobody wanted to explain to humanity what humanity had done. The Velsheri Patience was a monitoring vessel, not a warship. That distinction mattered, or at least it had mattered at the time. The Conclave was careful about distinctions like that. They had achieved their current position in galactic politics not through military expansion but through something they called measured presence, a philosophy of observing, assessing, and positioning themselves at the precise point between action and restraint where the maximum political leverage could be extracted. They were extraordinarily good at this. They had been practicing it for 11,000 years. The Patience had been assigned to observe the Corveth frontier, a stretch of space along the outer edge of the Conclave's recognized territory where, for the past 3 decades, the Corveth Dominion had been steadily encroaching. Not dramatically. Not in ways that would trigger formal protocols. The Corveth were too intelligent for that. They moved the boundary markers by fractions. They established resupply stations that were technically civilian but were staffed almost entirely by their military technical corps. They conducted what they called navigational surveys in corridors that, by any honest reading of the Conclave's spatial treaties, were not theirs to survey. The Velsheri watched all of this with the patience their vessel was named for, and they documented it, and they forwarded their documentation to committees, and the committees discussed the documentation in language so carefully constructed that it could be read as either a serious concern or a minor administrative irregularity depending on which political faction was interpreting it that week. This was normal. This was how the Conclave worked. What was not normal was the presence of Asha Ven. She was there because 3 years earlier, the Conclave had signed what they privately called the Adjacency Accords with humanity's Interstellar Liaison Office, a framework agreement that allowed human observers to be embedded with Velsheri monitoring operations in exchange for access to human long-range sensor data, which was unsophisticated by Velsheri standards but covered regions the Conclave's own network had not yet mapped. The agreement was considered mutually beneficial and politically uncomplicated. Humans were a relatively new species in terms of galactic participation. They had faster-than-light capability, they had some military capacity, but they were not yet a significant power. The Conclave had assessed them carefully. They were emotional, moderately intelligent, biologically interesting in certain stress response configurations, and fundamentally manageable. The human observer assigned to the Patience was a woman named Asha Ven. She was 34 years old, which in human biological terms meant she was somewhere in the first third of her expected lifespan. She held a title within the liaison office that translated roughly as Senior Field Analyst, which the Conclave's Cultural Assessment Division had interpreted as meaning she was moderately experienced but not particularly senior, likely assigned to this posting because it was considered a routine observation mission that carried very little risk. She had been on board for 7 months when the Corveth attack happened. The Velsheri crew of the Patience numbered 43. The attack was precise and, by Corveth standards, restrained. They had no interest in creating a galactic incident, only in removing the monitoring vessel from a region they had already privately determined would be theirs within the decade. The weapons they used were designed to disable rather than destroy. The hull was breached in 3 locations. The propulsion system was rendered inoperative. The long-range communication array was the first thing they targeted, because the Corveth were not reckless. They were strategic. They disabled the ability to call for help before they disabled anything else. 17 Velsheri crew members died in the initial breach. Not from weapons fire, from decompression in the sections that lost atmospheric containment before the emergency bulkhead sealed. Corveth had calculated this. It was, in their assessment, acceptable collateral elimination. The remaining 26 crew members, along with one human observer, were taken aboard a Corveth containment transport within 4 hours of the attack. Asha Ven was among them. The first thing the Corveth medical officer noted about the human was that she had been injured during the boarding and had not reported it. This was documented in the containment logs, which were later recovered and became part of the Conclave's precautionary incident summary. The medical officer, a Corveth named Dressenvel who had 18 years of field experience, had conducted intake assessments on all 31 captives. Not out of compassion but because it was standard Corveth procedure to document the physical condition of prisoners at the point of capture to protect against claims of mistreatment during what they anticipated would eventually be a diplomatic negotiation. When he scanned the human, the preliminary readout showed a fracture in 2 of the bones in her left arm and a soft tissue injury along her ribcage consistent with a significant impact. He noted this in the log and then, following procedure, asked her to confirm her injuries. She said the arm was a little sore but manageable. Dressenvel looked at his scanner. He looked at her. He noted in his log that the human appeared to be either misreporting her condition or operating under some form of physiological suppression that was blunting her pain response. He flagged this for later review and moved on. Later, reviewing the log, a Corveth intelligence analyst named Tharaz would mark this entry with a notation that said simply, *initial discrepancy. Possibly cultural, *. Tharaz would come to view this notation as the most inadequate thing he had ever written. The Velsheri prisoners were processed efficiently. The Corveth had done this before, in smaller incidents that had never quite risen to the level of formal galactic attention. They had developed a methodology. The prisoners would be held in a contained section of the transport. They would be given adequate nutrition and environmental conditions to maintain biological function, and they would be presented with a carefully structured sequence of communications that were designed to achieve voluntary compliance with a set of documents that, once signed, would effectively validate the Corvetha's territorial claims in the frontier region. This was not considered torture. The Corveth had a precise legal definition of torture, and what they were doing did not meet it. What they were doing was creating a controlled environment in which the rational decision, the decision any logically functioning entity would make given an accurate assessment of their situation, was to cooperate. The captives had no rescue coming. Their communications had been disabled at the source. The Conclave would eventually note the disappearance of the patients, but the Corveth had already prepared cover documentation suggesting the vessel had experienced a navigational malfunction and was presumed lost. By the time the Conclave investigated seriously, the documents would be signed, the prisoners would be released to a neutral station, and the diplomatic process would be presented with a fait accompli that it could protest but not reverse. The methodology worked because it was based on accurate modeling of how rational species behaved when their survival calculus was correctly understood. The Velsheri, in Corvetha's experience, were patient and politically sophisticated but ultimately pragmatic. They would calculate the cost of resistance against the probability of rescue and choose the path of lower risk. The human was the variable nobody had modeled. On the 4th day of captivity, one of the surviving Velsheri crew members, a navigation specialist named Orith, attempted to access a panel in the containment section's environmental control system. It was a small attempt, poorly executed, immediately detected. The Corveth guards responded with standard compliance measures. A brief neural disruption that caused approximately 40 seconds of involuntary muscular incapacitation, painful but not damaging. Orith was returned to the containment area. The Corveth noted the attempt in their logs, adjusted their surveillance protocols, and increased the frequency of their monitoring. Standard procedure. Expected outcome. The model predicted that a failed escape attempt early in captivity would actually accelerate cooperation, because it demonstrated to the prisoners that resistance was futile and recalibrated their understanding of their situation toward reality. Asha Ven had watched the entire event from across the containment area. She had said nothing. She had not moved to help Orith, had not reacted with visible distress, had not done anything that could be interpreted as resistance or solidarity. The Corvette guard who had been watching her specifically, they had decided early on that the human required specific monitoring, being an unknown biological variable, noted in his report that she had appeared calm throughout, which he interpreted as either shock or a recognition that cooperation was the logical path. He mentioned to Tharaz, the intelligence analyst, that the humans seemed to be adjusting well. Tharaz said nothing, but he reviewed the medical intake logs again. The fracture in her arm. The soft tissue injury. Manageable, she had said. He thought about that word for longer than he expected to. On the 7th day, the Corvette intelligence team began their structured communication sessions with the Velsheri captives. These were not interrogations in any aggressive sense. They were more like guided conversations. The Corvette would present certain documents, explain what the documents meant in terms of territorial resolution, acknowledge the difficult circumstances, and extend what they framed as an opportunity for the captives to facilitate a peaceful resolution to a situation that had escalated beyond what anyone had intended. This framing was deliberate. Corvette had learned that rational species responded poorly to explicit coercion but responded reasonably well to being offered the role of problem solver rather than victim. It was a reframing technique. It worked. 6 of the 26 Velsheri captives agreed to review the documentation by the end of the second session. The human observer was not invited to these sessions initially because she held no authority within Velsheri governance and her signature on any document would have no legal standing. She was, in Corvette's assessment, essentially irrelevant to the process. She was a complication only in that she represented a human diplomatic connection that would need to be managed, but the conclave agreement under which she was embedded gave the Velsheri primary diplomatic authority in the region. Her account of events would matter eventually, but by the time it mattered, the situation would be resolved. What the Corvette did not account for was what Asha Ven was doing during the hours they were not watching her. She was watching them. This was not a grand strategic plan. It was something closer to instinct, or perhaps habit, the kind of observational behavior that develops in people who have spent years working in environments where information is the only currency that matters. She watched how the guards moved. She watched which sections of the containment area received passive sensor coverage and which did not. She watched the Velsheri captives, the ones who were being summoned to sessions and the ones who came back from those sessions with the particular stillness of people who have begun the internal process of rationalizing capitulation. She also talked to them. The Corvette monitoring noted this. She spent considerable time in conversation with the Velsheri captives. They translated and reviewed these conversations, found them largely unremarkable. She asked about their families. She asked about their lives before the patients. She asked Orith, the navigation specialist who had attempted the panel access, about how he had learned to navigate. She asked him whether he had ever traveled to the outer reaches of the Velsheri home system. She asked him what the light was like there, whether it was different from what you saw in core space. Tharaz reviewed these conversations and flagged them as possibly a human cultural bonding behavior, perhaps designed to establish social cohesion among the captives. He noted that it seemed inefficient as a resistance strategy, if it was a resistance strategy at all. More likely, he concluded, it was simply how humans process stress, through social engagement, through the establishment of emotional connection as a coping mechanism. He was not wrong, exactly. He was just missing the other half of what was happening. What Asha Ven was doing in those conversations was also this. She was quietly, methodically, without any urgency that might be detected as urgency, transferring information. Not instructions. Not plans. Just understanding. The understanding of what the Corvette wanted, why they wanted it, what the documents meant, what the long-term implications were for the Velsheri frontier region if those documents were signed. She gave them no tactical guidance, made no attempt to organize them, issued nothing that could be called a directive. She simply made sure they understood what they were being asked to do. That was all. Because Corvette's methodology depended, at its foundation, on the captives experiencing their situation in isolation, not physical isolation, but cognitive isolation. The methodology worked when each captive was processing their circumstances through their own internal calculus, alone, weighing their personal survival against an abstract political outcome they could not fully assess. It worked because individually, the rational calculation almost always came out the same way. It stopped working when the captives were no longer processing in isolation. By the 12th day, the rate of document review agreements had slowed dramatically. Captives who had agreed to review documentation were now requesting clarification on specific clauses, citing concerns about long-term territorial implications that were legally, precise and legitimate and very difficult to simply dismiss. The Corveth intelligence team noted the shift and concluded that the captives had begun sharing information with each other, which was expected. What was not expected was the sophistication of the questions being raised. Thuraz reviewed the surveillance logs again. He watched Asha Ven sitting with Orith, asking him about light in the outer reaches of the home system. He began to feel something he would later describe, in the sanitized language of his official report, as analytical unease. On the 16th day, the Corveth made their first mistake. It was not a large mistake by any measurable standard. A guard, reassigning shift rotations due to a scheduling conflict, left a 7-minute window in which the passive sensor coverage of a specific section of the containment area was reduced to approximately 60% of normal capacity. This was noted in the shift log as a minor administrative irregularity that would be corrected in the next rotation. In those 7 minutes, Asha Ven moved through the containment area to a junction panel that Orith had identified for her, not in any conversation that had been flagged, but in the way someone who has been asked about navigational principles might casually, almost academically, describe the general configuration of a monitoring transport's environmental relay systems, speaking in abstract terms, in the language of someone sharing professional knowledge with no particular application in mind. She did not attempt to access the panel. She did not have the technical capability to do so. What she did was remove the panel cover, look at the relay configuration inside, photograph it with a personal device she had been permitted to retain because the Corveth had assessed its communication capacity and correctly determined it had no signal range sufficient to reach any external receiver, and replace the panel cover. Then she went back to her section and resumed the conversation she had been having with a Velsheri crew member about the cultural significance of certain plant species in Velsheri cuisine. The guard who reviewed the sensor logs for that shift noted the reduction in coverage, noted that no unusual activity had been recorded during the gap, and filed the administrative correction. What he did not realize, what no one on the Corveth monitoring team realized yet, was that Asha Ven had not needed to contact any external receiver, because she had not been building a plan to escape. She had been building a plan to make the Corvetha's methodology stop working from the inside, using nothing except information, patience, and the specific human capability for sustaining a long-term goal across a time frame that would be, for most species under these conditions, psychologically unsustainable. On the 18th day, 2 of the 6 Velsheri captives who had agreed to review the documentation withdrew their review agreements, citing procedural concerns. On the 21st day, the Corveth intelligence team recommended accelerating their timeline. Thuraz requested a direct session with the human observer on the 23rd day. This was a departure from their original approach, and he knew it. But the situation had developed in ways that his models had not predicted, and he had spent enough time reviewing the surveillance data to believe, not definitively, not in a way he could fully justify in a formal report, that the human was the variable he had not adequately accounted for. The session was conducted in a small room adjacent to the containment area. Asha Ven sat across a narrow table from Thuraz, and she sat with the particular stillness of someone who is not performing calm but who is genuinely, functionally calm in a way that is itself slightly unsettling. Her left arm rested on the table. The fracture had been healing for 3 weeks without medical intervention. Thuraz told her that he appreciated her cooperative behavior during her time aboard the transport. He told her that he understood the situation was difficult. He told her that the Corveth had no interest in prolonging the situation and that he hoped she understood the importance of resolution for the sake of everyone involved, including her own safety and eventual return to human jurisdiction. She listened to all of this without interrupting, which the Velsheri captives rarely managed. When he finished, she said, "What would you like to know?" It was a simple question. Thuraz had prepared for deflection, for emotional appeal, for political posturing. He had not prepared for that particular openness, because in his experience, genuine openness from a captive at this stage of a process meant either that they were about to cooperate fully or that they were confident in a way that he should find concerning. He asked her how she understood the current situation. She told him that she understood the Corvette wanted the Velsheri captives to sign documents validating their territorial claims, that the methodology being used was designed to present this as a rational choice, and that the captives were being managed in a way that was sophisticated and experienced and had probably worked before. Thuraz had not expected that level of accurate summary. He asked her why she was telling him this. She said, "Because you already know that I know, or you wouldn't have requested this session. And I think we're both more comfortable having this conversation directly." There was a long pause. He asked her what she wanted. She said, "The same thing I've always wanted. I want to go home. I want my colleagues to go home. I want the people who died in the breach to have mattered." The last part was where the register shifted, not dramatically, not with any performance of grief. It was a single sentence added to the end of a practical list, and the way it was added suggested that for her, it was on the same list. That the dead were a practical concern, not just an emotional one. That their deaths were something she was carrying as a functional weight, not processing as a past event. Thuraz made a note. Humans treat obligation to the dead as active and ongoing, not ceremonial. He did not fully understand what he had noted yet. He told her that he sympathized, and that he hoped she could help facilitate a cooperative resolution. She said she would think about it. She did not seem like someone who was going to help facilitate anything. She seemed like someone who was going to do exactly what she had been doing for 23 days, which was something that Thuraz was beginning to suspect he had not fully identified yet. The Corvette made their second mistake on the 27th day. It was larger. Acting on a recommendation from the intelligence team that the timeline needed to accelerate, they transferred Orith, the navigation specialist, to a separate, more isolated containment section, on the theory that he had become a point of communication and that separating him from the main group would disrupt whatever informal coordination had developed. This was, by the metrics they were using, a reasonable decision. In their models of captive group dynamics, removing a communication node should degrade the network's function. What the model did not account for was that the coordination had not been centered on Orith. It had never been centered on any single person. It had been distributed, quietly, patiently, over 27 days of conversations about family and food and light, into the social fabric of the group in a way that did not have a single node to remove. Separating Orith did not disrupt the network. It made the network angry. This distinction, between disruption and anger, was one the Corvette had not built into their models, because in their experience, these were two different things, and anger in a captive population was generally manageable through the same compliance mechanisms that managed everything else. What they had not modeled was what happened when the anger was not expressed outwardly but was instead incorporated, added to the weight that was already being carried and carried forward. After Orith was transferred, the rate of document compliance dropped to 0. Not through organized protest. Not through any communicable act of resistance. It simply stopped, as if the captives had, each individually, arrived at the same conclusion by their own separate internal arithmetic. Because they had. Because Asha Ven had given them the arithmetic 3 weeks ago, and they had been running the numbers ever since, and when Orith was taken away, the answer came out the same for all of them, simultaneously. Thuraz reviewed the new data and felt the analytical unease he had been managing to sharpen into something more specific. He requested the sensor logs for the full 27 days and reviewed them over 14 hours. When he finished, he wrote a report that he marked as restricted and sent only to the transport commander and to a single contact in the Corvette Strategic Assessment Division. The report was 3 pages long. The last paragraph read, "I do not believe we have correctly assessed the human observer's function in this situation. I am unable to determine the full scope of what she has achieved or how she has achieved it, which is itself the primary concern I am raising. We have been observing this individual continuously for 27 days. I cannot account for her methodology. I can only account for its outcomes. Recommend immediate review of human observer isolation. They moved her to a private containment room on the 28th day. She was told it was for her comfort. There was no attempt to make this sound convincing. The room was small and had nothing in it except a sleeping surface, a hygiene facility, and a table. No contact with the Velsheri captives. No personal device, which was removed on the grounds that its internal battery required servicing. No window. Full sensor coverage. A Corvette psychoanalyst was brought aboard to assess her condition. The analyst's name was Rem, and she approached the assessment with methodical professionalism. She had studied 14 sentient species. She had extensive experience in behavioral pattern identification. She reviewed the surveillance data before meeting with Asha Ven and formed preliminary hypotheses about what she would encounter: likely stress response behaviors, possible depressive indicators, perhaps some form of sustained coping mechanism that had allowed the human to present as more stable than she was. What she encountered instead was a woman sitting at the table who asked her, within the first 3 minutes of the session, whether Rem had been briefed on the fracture in her arm or whether she should summarize the injury history herself. Rem noted that this was atypical opening behavior for a captive under these conditions. She also noted that the arm appeared to be functioning fully, 28 days without medical treatment, and the human was using it normally. The fracture was not healed. Her scanner confirmed it was still in process, but the human was using the arm as if it were not relevant to her current priorities. Over 6 sessions, Rem built what she would later describe as an incomplete picture. She identified elements she recognized. The human used social bonding as a genuine emotional regulator, not a strategic tool, though the line between those was apparently thin for this species. She processed grief by incorporating it into purpose. The dead colleagues were not grieved and then set aside but remained active in her internal motivation structure in a way that was functionally indistinguishable from ongoing obligation. She had a high pain tolerance that did not appear to be anesthetic numbness but rather a capacity to prioritize across multiple competing discomforts simultaneously, allowing her to simply deprioritize pain when other things required more processing. What Rem could not account for was the persistence. She wrote in her formal assessment, "I expected to find an individual whose stable presentation was a surface over internal disintegration. I did not find disintegration. After 28 days of captivity, injury, the deaths of colleagues, and isolation, the human appears to be operating at close to normal psychological capacity. I do not have an adequate framework for this. My training models predict significant degradation under these conditions. I am not observing significant degradation. I am observing, instead, a kind of psychological durability that I cannot fully characterize except to say that it does not appear to have an obvious endpoint. I cannot identify a point at which her current trajectory would result in the compliance state we require." Rem sent this assessment to Tharaz. Tharaz read it twice and then held it without responding for 40 minutes. Then he sent a message to the Strategic Assessment Division. The message said, "Please retrieve anything you have on documented extended conflict with human parties. Specifically, documented duration of human engagement following initial hostile contact. Any duration data you have, *. The response came back in 11 hours. The data was sparse, because human military history as it related to interstellar engagement was limited. They were still a relatively new galactic participant. But there were 3 minor territorial disputes in human-adjacent space, 2 of them with species that had since normalized relations with humanity, one of them still technically unresolved. There were the records from humanity's own historical archive that they had voluntarily shared with the Conclave as part of the Adjacency Accords, their own internal military history, which the Conclave's Cultural Division had reviewed and found interesting but not alarming. Tharaz pulled those records. He read about something called the 100 Years' War, which had in fact continued beyond 100 years by any metric that accounted for the full arc of the conflict. He read about a war that had officially ended with a nuclear exchange and had then persisted, politically and strategically, for decades afterward, shaping the next century of human development. He read about insurgencies that had continued for 40, 50, 60 years after every rational analysis suggested they should have stopped. He read about humans who had, in documented cases, continued fighting in jungles and mountains and deserts for years after official conflict resolution, Because no one had told them it was over, or because they had decided that the resolution was not legitimate, or simply because they had not finished. He sat with this for a long time. Then he looked at the date. 29 days since the attack on the patients. Corvetha's timeline had originally projected compliance within 30 days. That timeline had already been revised twice. The captives were still not cooperating. The human was in an isolated room, injured, separated from everyone she knew, with no communication and no rescue and no visible hope. And according to Rem's assessment, she did not appear to have an obvious endpoint. He pulled the historical data again and read it more carefully. He found something the Cultural Division's original review had noted as a behavioral curiosity and filed without significant concern. Human populations, when engaged in conflict, demonstrated a documented pattern of increasing commitment over time rather than decreasing commitment. Where most species modeled conflict engagement as a declining resource, the longer a conflict continued, the more both parties were motivated to find resolution because the cost of continuation outweighed the probability of gain. Human populations frequently demonstrated the opposite. The longer the conflict continued, the more the human party had integrated the conflict into their identity, their social structures, their sense of obligation to those who had already died in it. The dead were not a cost that increased the pressure to stop. For humans, the dead were a reason to continue. Thuraz read this 3 times. Then he put the data down and looked at nothing in particular for a while. The Corvetha's entire methodology was built on a model of rational de-escalation under pressure. It was built on the understanding that any species, given enough time and the right environmental conditions, would eventually calculate that cooperation was the lower-cost path. It was built on the understanding that there was a point at which every rational entity stopped. He was looking at historical data that suggested the human species did not reliably reach that point. Not because they were irrational, but because their accounting was different. Because the weight on their side of the equation included things that did not depreciate over time. Things that got heavier. He wrote a new message to the Strategic Assessment Division. This one was longer. He sent it with an unusual request. Could someone in the division find an older record, something from early galactic records, something that mentioned humanity not in the context of their recent interstellar emergence but in any context, from any source? The division took 3 days. What they sent back was not a military record. It was a diplomatic communication, filed in the Galactic Archival Repository, dated approximately 80 years prior, from a species called the Orathi, a mid-tier civilization that had, at that time, been attempting to establish what they described as a controlled commercial relationship with the then primitive humanity. The communication was addressed to another species, not to the conclave. It was a private correspondence, recovered through routine archival access. It read, in relevant part, *, we attempted to leverage their debt position to renegotiate the extraction rights in question. They refused. We applied structural pressure over a period of 4 years. They refused again. At the 8-year mark, we were advised by our strategic council to simply wait. The species was economically vulnerable, and time, we believed, would achieve what pressure had not. At the 12-year mark, we settled on their original terms. I relay this to you not as a failure of strategy but as a warning. This species does not become more pliable under extended pressure. They become more fixed. They develop what I can only describe as an institutional memory of the slight. They did not merely remember that we had pressured them. They built frameworks around that memory. They taught it to the next generation as a principle. When the Strategic Council argued that 12 years was an unacceptably long timeline to maintain our position, I told them, be grateful it was only 12. I do not know what the upper limit is. I am not sure there is one. Thuraz read this document in the early hours of the 32nd day since the attack. Then he went to find the transport commander. Commander Veth listened to Thuraz's summary without interrupting. This was characteristic of Veth, who had commanded Corveth operations for 30 years and had survived politically by virtue of knowing the precise moment when his own assessment needed to be subordinated to someone else's. When Thuraz finished, Veth asked 2 questions. The first was, what, in Thuraz's assessment, would happen if they maintained the current approach? Thuraz said, the Velsheri captives will not sign the documents. We have now lost approximately half the window in which our cover story about the patients remains plausible. If we extend this operation much further, the Conclave's investigation will close the gap between what we've told them and what happened. The humans' diplomatic status will become a complicating factor at that point that we do not want. The second question was, what would happen if they released the captives? Tharaz said, I can't guarantee what happens. That's the specific problem I'm raising. Veth looked at the documentation Tharaz had assembled. The historical data. The Orathi communication. Rem's psychological assessment. She's one person, Veth said. In a room. With nothing. Yes, Tharaz said. That appears to be the situation. And you believe she represents a serious risk to this operation. Tharaz did not answer immediately. He had spent 3 days trying to construct a precise answer to this question, and he had arrived at one he did not fully like. I believe, he said slowly, that she is doing something we don't fully understand, and that our model of how this situation resolves requires us to understand what everyone involved is doing. We understand what the Velsheri captives are doing. We don't understand what she's doing, and we haven't been able to understand it despite 32 days of continuous observation. That is the risk I'm raising. Veth studied the Orathi document again. I'm not sure there is one. What about her arm? He asked. Tharaz was quiet for a moment. Still unhealed. She's using it anyway. They released Orith from the isolated section on the 34th day, on the grounds that his isolation had not produced the intended effect and was consuming monitoring resources that were needed elsewhere. When Orith was returned to the main containment area, he sat down next to a younger crew member who had been struggling, and he talked to her for 2 hours. The content of the conversation was monitored, but, by this stage of the operation, Tharaz had stopped expecting the monitoring to tell him what he needed to know. What he was watching for instead was the reaction of the group. The group, when Orith returned, became measurably more stable. Not louder. Not more active. More stable. As if his return had confirmed something they had believed but needed confirmed. Tharaz noted this and added it to his report, and then wrote a single line at the bottom that he almost deleted because it seemed too subjective for a formal document. Asterisk, the human has created something among this group that I cannot name with precision. It is not morale in the conventional sense. It is more like a shared conviction that their situation is survivable and that their compliance is not required. Asterisk. He left the line in. Asha Ven spent the days of her isolation at the table. She slept the hours her body required and not more. She ate the nutrition the Corveth provided, because not eating served nothing. She performed whatever physical movement was possible in the small room, because her body was a tool she intended to keep functional. She did not perform any of these things with particular discipline or ceremony. She performed them the way you maintained equipment you needed, steadily, without sentiment, because the alternative was not acceptable. She thought about Orith. She thought about the other captives. She thought about the 17 people who had died in the decompression. She did not push those thoughts away, because pushing them away required energy she didn't want to spend and because the thoughts were not what was consuming her. They were what was fueling her. She thought about the session with Tharaz. The way he had looked at her across the table. The specific quality of his attention, which was different from the other Corveth she had encountered, less procedural, more genuinely trying to understand something. She had recognized it because she felt it herself, often, looking at situations that didn't fit the model she was using to understand them. She thought that Tharaz was close to understanding something. She thought that might matter. She did not think about rescue. Not because she had given up on it, but because whether rescue was coming or not was outside her influence and therefore not a useful subject of sustained thought. She thought instead about what she could do with what she had, which was very little except time and the particular human capacity to spend time in a way that doesn't look like spending it. She was waiting. Not passively. The way a river waits. The way water waits behind a dam, not with urgency but with the absolute patience of something that has gravity on its side and is in no particular hurry because hurry is not relevant to what gravity does. On the 40th day, Tharaz came to her room alone. He sat down across the table and said, I want to ask you something directly. She said, all right. He said, why aren't you afraid? She was quiet for a moment, and what he read on her face was not the absence of emotion but the presence of something more complex than the single emotion he was asking about. "I am afraid," she said. "That's not the same as being stopped by it." He considered this. Then he said, "What do you want from this?" "Not the official answer. What do you actually want?" She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "I want you to understand that this isn't going to end the way you planned. Not because I've done anything heroic. Because this," she gestured at the room, at him, at the table between them, "is already in the record. Everything that happened to the patients is in the record. The people who died are in the record. And records don't stay private forever. They especially don't stay private when someone is going to spend however long it takes making sure they don't." Thiraz sat with this. "Someone," he said. "Many people," she said. "Eventually. You're talking about your species." "I'm talking about people who were on that ship," she said. "I'm talking about what they're worth." That was the sentence that stayed with him. Not a threat. Not a negotiating position. An accounting. The dead were in the ledger, and the ledger was going to be balanced, not out of strategy but out of something that felt, to Thiraz, almost geological in its certainty. Something that didn't require her to win right now because it wasn't organized around right now. It was organized around eventually. He went back to Veth that night and told him that his recommendation had changed. The captives were released on the 44th day. Not to a neutral station, as originally planned. To a Velsheri rescue vessel that had been, as it turned out, searching the frontier region for 22 days following the Conclave's determination that the patients had not experienced a navigational malfunction and that the Corvetha's cover documentation contained inconsistencies that required explanation. The Corvetha's withdrawal from the situation was managed diplomatically, carefully framed, hedged with enough bureaucratic language to allow multiple interpretations, structured in a way that avoided the word surrender in every language it was translated into. They did not sign anything that validated Velsheri territorial authority. They simply stopped. They reversed course and stopped, citing a mutual interest in regional stability and the importance of avoiding escalation. Thiraz wrote his final report on the 46th day, aboard a Corvette vessel returning to home space. The report was thorough and honest, and he knew it would be read by very few people and filed in a division that was not widely consulted. He wrote it anyway because he believed it was the most important document he had produced in his career, and because he was the kind of person who wrote what needed to be written regardless of who would read it. The report's final section was not a recommendation. It was an observation. We treated the human observer as a secondary variable in a situation we believed we controlled. We had enough information to understand that humans demonstrate unusual persistence in conflict scenarios, and we categorized this information as a behavioral curiosity rather than a strategic factor. This was an error of categorization, not of information. The information was available. We chose not to weight it appropriately. What I observed in 44 days of contact with this individual was not a special case. I want to be precise about this. She was not exceptional in the way that word usually implies. She was not more capable than her species, not extraordinary in some individual sense. What she demonstrated was, as best I can assess, simply what her species does under extended pressure. They continue. The calculus by which we expected her to reach a compliant state is not a calculus she was running. She was running a different calculation entirely, one that included variables we didn't place in the model. The dead, specifically, as an active and non-depreciating weight on the ledger, and a time horizon that did not have a visible terminus. I have reviewed the available historical data on human conflict duration. I want to record here, for the benefit of anyone who reads this, that the Corvette Strategic Assessment Division should formally and urgently revise its classification of humanity within the threat matrix framework. Not because they are militarily formidable in the conventional sense, by standard metrics, they are not, but because the model we use to predict when a conflict becomes untenable for an opposing party does not apply to them in the ways we assumed. Every civilization we have encountered has a breaking point that is, functionally, a calculation. The calculation may be complex, but it is a calculation. The cost of continuing eventually outweighs the value of the goal, and the entity stops. Asterisk. Asterisk. I cannot find this feature in humans. I cannot find the calculation. I can find what looks like it, the fear, the pain, the loss, all the inputs we expect to produce the output. But the output does not arrive on schedule. It may not arrive at all. And what takes its place is something I am not equipped to name, except to say that it functions like a replacement fuel source that is generated by the conflict itself, specifically by the cost of the conflict, the weight of what has been spent, and that it appears to increase in intensity over time rather than decrease. Asterisk. Asterisk. If this is a species-wide trait and not an individual anomaly, and the historical record suggests it is, then any party that initiates conflict with humanity should understand the following. You will not wear them down. You may damage them, and you may damage them severely, but damage in humans appears to function differently than in other species we have encountered. It does not produce the compliance state. It may produce the opposite. Asterisk. Asterisk. I do not know the upper limit of this. I am not certain there is one. Asterisk. Asterisk. The woman's arm, by the end of the 44th day, was almost fully functional. She had been using it throughout. She did not seem to believe this was remarkable. Asterisk. Asha then filed her own report 41 days after her return to human jurisdiction. It was considerably shorter than Therasis. The liaison office had wanted a detailed accounting of her activities during the 44 days of captivity, and she had provided one, and then at the end she had added a section titled Observations that was not requested and that became, internally, the most discussed part of the document. She wrote, Asterisk. I want to note, for the record, that the Corvette intelligence personnel I interacted with were not unintelligent or carelessly cruel. They were operating a system that had probably worked before, and they had assessed us in good faith using the frameworks they had. The frameworks were wrong, but the failure was in the frameworks, not in the people. I think it's worth saying that, because the instinct after something like this is to characterize the other party as foolish or brutal, and I don't think that serves anyone. Asterisk. Asterisk. What I think happened is that they didn't believe we would keep going. I think most species, when they reach a point where the rational outcome is submission or escape, do one of those things. And I think we were confusing to them because we weren't exactly doing either. We were just continuing, waiting for the situation to change and trusting that it would, not because we had evidence it would, but because stopping wasn't something we were willing to do. Asterisk. Asterisk. I'm not sure that's a strength. I want to be careful about calling it a strength, because the same thing that makes it hard to break us is the same thing that makes it hard for us to know when we should stop. Those are the same feature. I think it matters to know that. Asterisk. Asterisk. The 17 people who died in the decompression of the patients were Coordinator Ellen Marsh, Propulsion Technician, asterisk. She named all 17. The report continued for 3 pages after the names, technical and factual and precise. She never mentioned her arm. The precautionary incident summary, when it was finally completed 18 months later, was distributed to 37 member species of the Galactic Forum's observer community. The Velsheri had insisted on its distribution over Corvette objections, not as a punitive measure but as what they called a navigational document, something that would help the broader community understand a situation they had collectively misunderstood. The summary was 7,000 words long and contained, in its final section, a passage that would be quoted in every diplomatic briefing about human engagement for the next century. Asterisk. The primary error in the assessment of the human observer's function was categorical. She was classified as a secondary factor in a controlled situation. This classification was based on an accurate assessment of her individual capabilities by conventional metrics and an inaccurate assessment of the relationship between her individual capabilities and the broader behavioral matrix of her species. The conventional metrics were real. The relationship was the part we missed. Asterisk. Asterisk. It is the position of the Conclave's assessment authority that any party considering an adversarial approach to a situation involving human parties, whether individual, diplomatic, or military, should proceed from the following foundational understanding. Humans do not disengage from conflicts on the same timeline as other species. They do not reach the standard compliance threshold. They do not deprioritize obligation to their dead. They incorporate cost into motivation rather than using it as a signal to stop. Asterisk. We are not qualified to assess the upper limit of this pattern. We are not certain that an upper limit exists. Asterisk. We recommend caution. The document was filed. The category it had been filed under remained nameless. 3 committees had now submitted proposals, and all 3 had been rejected because every name chosen felt, to everyone who reviewed it, like it was either understating something or misstating something, and the committees could not agree on which. What they were trying to name was not quite a threat and not quite a warning. It was something closer to accounting. A record of a thing they had seen but not fully understood, filed carefully, because you filed the things you didn't understand even more carefully than the things you did. Somewhere in human jurisdiction, a woman with a healed arm was sitting at a desk, writing names. The universe had expected her to break. She had simply continued. And in the hallways of the Velsheri Conclave, in the Strategic Assessment Division of the Corveth Dominion, in 37-member species diplomatic archives, a document without a name sat in a category without a category, quietly being read by people who were beginning to understand that they had looked at something they thought was manageable and had misread what it was. Not a threat they could measure, a permanence they could not outlast.